speaking at people's memorial services or funerals. I want you to tell me about both Bob Marvel and Harry King and Alice Bartlett, all of which are just names
Okay.
on a building to us, but you knew these people. Who do you want to start with?
I'll start with Harry King, who I knew the least.
Okay.
Harry King was retired when I got here, and not well. And Bob Marvel had worked for him, and would take care of him and took me over to meet him. And sometimes he would come here, and we'd give him special treatment. He had some mobility problems, and then Harry passed away, and not 30 feet from where we're sitting, Bob Marvel dedicated this hall to Harry King when he himself was a very sick man.
Oh.
And I helped him right to the edge of the stage, but not seen. He gave me his cane, and he stumbled out to the lectern. He didn't want to be seen walking with a cane. And he was already a terminally ill man, but not too many of us knew. But he became my closest friend in Fredonia, and he was my son, who was born here in 1970.
And he was your boss, is that
He was
right?
my boss,
Uh-huh.
and my son, who was born here in 1973, he was he was my son's godfather. Although I knew then he had a terminal illness, and he got off the stage, and I knew right then that in the not too distant future, I would be giving the same kind of a dedication speech to another theater in this building. I just knew that was going to happen soon. And I went on a leave of absence right after he died. He died on April 15th, 1974. And in July, I was given a 2-year leave of absence to go do another project, which was to get the Tulsa Performing Arts Center designed and built. And it was well on its way to finished design, and we were getting ready to break ground. And all I really could do was fix some minor mistakes they had, because there weren't a lot of fixes to be had when you're in your final drawings. And I came back a year later to give that speech, one of 3 speeches that were given, one of which was given by his son, who's now probably a semi-retired lawyer in Dallas. He went to practice law in Dallas. And then there was a 3rd speech, and I don't remember who gave the 3rd. It might have been the president. And I walked out the door crying, saying I can never come back. And I didn't. This was 1978, and I didn't come back until 1988. With my wife, we were on our way to Vermont from Akron, Ohio, where I was running the Performing Arts Center. And we stopped, and we stayed for 3 days. We stayed at the White Inn. And I wish I could stay there now, but it's closed up. I wish I could buy it and run it, but I'm too old to start a new business. And we stayed at the White Inn, and we had dinner at Harry John Brown's house, and twice. And one of those nights, her name was Pat Woodbury then. She later became Paige Woodbury. She and I founded the Lakeshore Association for the Arts. I don't know if it's still in existence.
It has changed names several times and merged, but it's now, that evolution, it is now the Reg Linné Center for the Arts in Jamestown. It's a restored historic movie.
It was a file drawer in my desk back then. It was a way to get money from the State Arts Council to put shows into this hall, because they would not give grants to SUNY branches.
Right.
So we started an arts organization. And it was Pat and I and Pat's husband, who was the lawyer who incorporated, who also was Woodbury Winery.
Okay.
He and his brother had inherited 400 or 500 acres of grapes, and his brother had a degree in winemaking from Cornell School of Agriculture. He gave up a bond practice as a lawyer in New York, came back here, had a minimal practice as a lawyer. He was the Village of Sheridan's attorney. I'm not sure that requires a lot of lawyering. And he was running a winery. And we were here for their first vintage, which was horrible. But they went to Europe and got their rootstock. But you got to let that stuff grow. But you eventually have to put out a vintage and get your name out there. And by the 2nd or 3rd year, they owned They opened a wine shop in Manhattan, and they were selling wine, and they were winning some ribbons. But I guess in that business, there's a ribbon for every winery. There's enough shows that everybody wins something. But we started that arts council, and it was just a few of us. they came to dinner at Harry John's and brought a selection of their wines. And they still hadn't gotten it down pat with their champagne by 1985. And had a very enjoyable time in 1985. And then didn't come back until 5 years ago with my now wife. My wife from when I lived here passed away in 1980. And then I was a single dad of 2 children. But I came back with my current wife 5 years ago, and we were going to a wedding in the Finger Lakes of
On your
people,
way.
and we were coming and making a week of it. So we went the opposite direction, and we went to Niagara Falls one day, and then we drove over here one day. I think I called you the day before to ask you if you were in town.
Yeah.
And we spent the day here. We didn't spend the night here. And we went through a number of things around the Finger Lakes and made a week of it. And put 1,000 miles on a rental car in that week.
Yeah.
And that's the last time I was here, was 5 years ago. So this is my second time back. This is my third time back since 1975 when I gave that speech. But I haven't been back to the University of Akron, where I 11 years.
They laid the whole staff off.
They closed
there
it up. They closed up the
Saturday Night
program.
Massacre.
And I haven't been back to the theater I ran as a student and as a graduate student in Syracuse. I was one of the founders of Syracuse Stage.
Oh, wow.
4 of us wrote a grant proposal for a class to start a professional theater company in Syracuse. Professor said, this is pretty good. Why don't you submit it to a couple of foundations? So we did. And one of them gave us $250,000, provided the university would match it. The university matched it in kind, with a facility to perform in,
I see.
with faculty to work in it.
Now, is that still a going concern?
It is one of the old, it was Syracuse Repertory Theater at the time. Arthur Storch, who was a well-known Broadway director, came in 30 years ago, maybe 35 years ago, changed his name to Syracuse Stage because they were no longer doing repertory, and put it on the map. We put life in it, and he put it, and he grew it to an adult, and it's one of the good professional repertory theaters in the United States, and one of the original LORT theaters. That stands for Legal Resident Theaters.
Right.
One of the originals. I think there were 10. It was modeled after the McCarter Theater in Princeton, where John Lithgow ran it. Arthur Lithgow.
Okay.
John Lithgow, the actor's father.
Okay.
And we went there after we wrote this proposal and says, how do we start a theater? We've got money. How do we start a theater? And he said, the first thing you need to do is go talk to Actors Equity and get a contract. That's the first thing, because you're not a professional theater unless you're an equity theater. And so that's the first thing we did, and signed a contract with Actors Equity. And I don't know how we got to that. How did we get here?
I don't.
How did we
I
get
don't
here?
know, but we have a graduate, Jennifer Cody, who performed last night, and she and her husband, Hunter Foster, are associated with another newer theater in Syracuse now.
People who do something more cutting edge.
I don't know. They were doing Rent, and Jen had
Yeah,
just
that's
directed Rent, and that's why she couldn't get here till the rehearsal.
Our
the afternoon
opening
rehearsal
season
yesterday.
was Man and Superman, Thurber Carnival, starring Frank Langella. Two Albee plays, The Zoo Story and The American Dream, and Tiger at the Gates. I believe that's Ennui, Tiger at the Gates. We were serious repertory, and I can imagine there's a need for people who and the second season they did Midsummer Night's Dream with an original score.
Wow.
And Richard Dyer Bennett, who was a traveling minstrel, well known at the time, wrote some books in the show. But they stayed into largely classical and semi-classical stuff. The newest stuff they probably would have done was Death of a Salesman.
Let's come back to Fredonia.
Yes.
So we talked a little about Harry King and Bob Marvel. Alice Bartlett.
Alice and I were not close like I was with Bob Marvel, but I respected her, and she did largely readers' theater when I was here. The actors sometimes carried their scripts, but sometimes just sat on stools, and almost never sets. And But she was a real theater person. She had a background and a doctorate in theater, and it slowly migrated. She was here when I came, and I don't know how many years before I came. It slowly migrated, even though she did all of her shows in the black box theater where you can't really have much scenery. There were set pieces and benches and things that got moved around. And she migrated more and more into things that were not meant to be Reader's Theater. I mean, Reader's Theater at the time was things like Spoon River Anthology by Edgar Lee Masters. And she started doing some real plays. And I'm not certain, but I think she might have done The Crucible with her group. There were two groups producing plays, the Pierians and the Mummers. And they would produce with student money. Although faculty directed them and students acted them, and occasionally faculty appeared in them. I appeared in a couple of shows here when they needed somebody who was over 22 on stage. We did Our Town, and I played the old professor, a walk-on, and I walk off, and I didn't even stay for the curtain call. I didn't want to stay around for an hour and a half more. And I did a couple of things like that, and so did a lot of the other faculty. It's difficult getting an 18-year-old to play a 60-year-old with any credibility, but I was 30 at the time, maybe a 30-year-old could, and probably not. I probably was not very convincing. But Alice was the Reader's Theater person, and she had her following, and certain students only worked for her, and certain worked for the directors. Jack Cogdill was running the theater department at the time, and he directed most of the plays, but not all of them. We had another director named Howard Poyero, and I helped him put together a production of a show that I had done in professional rep called Slow Dance on the Killing Ground. And I actually was his producer, and then he directed the show, and we edited it together. But it was a very small theater faculty. It was the three of them and two technicians.
So Jack had been here as chair before you got
Jack
here?
came the year I came.
Okay.
He had
And
come a
was
couple
that
of months
sort of
before I
the
did.
Founding of the department?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It was Alice Bartlett before that, and it was Reader's Theater, and I don't know where it performed before this building opened. She was probably in the English department. And they created the theater department. And a lot of this, before they had real theater departments, they were in the English department.
Right. And so you were here for about 4 years as director.
I was full-time 4 years, and I held the title for another year, and I booked a season. And the person who was acting director called me on a fairly regular basis.
Who was that?
My secretary.
Oh, Nancy Palmer.
Nancy Palmer was the acting director for that year, and then Ted Deedy took over. He had been my assistant, but he was just out of the military when I hired him as an assistant.
And did Nancy stay as his secretary?
No,
Okay.
they did not get along. They did not get along, and she was upset that they were paying him much more than they were paying her.
Okay, I've heard that
He was
story,
initially,
but I didn't realize
she actually sued.
and got a settlement
collected.
and
Got
got
a
a
settlement,
judgment.
yeah.
She got a judgment from the judge.
She actually sued.
It took a long time to settle to adjudicate that.
And sadly, she died a few years later.
It wasn't settled. It wasn't resolved by the judge until after I'd been here for a while. And I remember Don McPhee was president, and I think it was a $5,000 payment or 10 or something.
It wasn't a lot.
That the campus had to make. She sued on 2 counts. One is you were underpaying me because I was a woman, and the other was you should have given me the job. Well, she won on the first one but lost on the second.
She couldn't have won on you should have given me the job. She didn't have a college degree.
Yeah.
And colleges can't hire professionals unless they were distinguished in the profession without degrees.
Yeah.
She couldn't have won on the second one.
I remember one of the college administrators said, "What do I do?" And the answer that he got from whoever the authoritative source was, which I think was the head of personnel, was pay it.
Yeah, I did a telephone deposition. I remember. I don't know if they used it for anything, but I did a telephone deposition for her attorney.
So can you tell me anything about the development of the theater program and department during the time you were here? How did it change and grow?
Well, it grew. It grew. First, there was one director, and Jack Cogdill directed everything, and Leanne Cogdill, his wife, directed the Children's Theater. shows, and I'm not sure she was even on the faculty at that time. She just might have been paid separately. And then there was one technician hired. Ted Janello was his name. And then Jack brought a second technician who had been a student at Texas Christian University. His name was Jim Coppich. Then he brought in another director, and that was Howard Poyero, who passed away a few years ago. Brilliant director. Did different kind of stuff than Jack. He did the cutting edge stuff, and he was out there somewhere past the moon, and thought that way. And his wife was an actress who did a little bit of acting. Then there was another guy brought in named Joe Gustafson or Gustafaro. It was Italian, Gustafaro, and his wife Leilani, and she was an actress, and she did some work here. And I don't know who did the costumes. Somehow the costumes got done, but I don't know if it was a faculty position or somebody else designed them in another city and then they were made here. I just don't know how the costumes were made. It was not something in my domain. And then we started a summer theater company, the Fredonia Summer Theater. And I was the producer, and Jack was the artistic director. And Leanne would direct one show. I think I only directed one show in 2 or 3 years.
And where would you do these?
In the Marvel Theater. And they were light things and small musicals. And I can't remember what any of the shows were. I still have the season brochure somewhere and the stuff that's gathering
next
dust.
Next time you find
I'll
them
dig them
for
out.
our archives.
I'll dig them out. There was a Fredonia Summer Theater, and I couldn't get the newspaper to review us because they didn't have a theater reviewer. So they said, submit a review. Submit a review. So we made up the name of a reviewer, and I wrote reviews, and sometimes I'd let the director help me write the views. And no matter how bad the show was, we always said something nice, like it's hot in the summer and it's cool in the theater. Make a night of it. You know?
Right.
We suggest you make a night of it. You know,
Thinking of all the
I never
theaters.
panned the shows, but I wouldn't rave about a show that wasn't raveable. But some of the shows were raveable. Yeah. A lot depends on the material you start with. You know, and then if you can get your best students to stay around, and they used to get credit. They used to get credit for. And when I was an undergraduate, I went on the road with a show from Syracuse, 2 shows. We carried 2 shows, and we toured them for 6 weeks.
Wow.
And we got credit for this. And I remember the year I did it, it was the O'Casey's, The Plow and the Stars, and I can't remember what the other show was, but it was a comedy. And we would do them. We'd go to a town, a college town. They'd give us dormitory space because it was summer, it was vacant, and we did almost all what are now the SUNY schools. It was before SUNY, and some in Pennsylvania, and you really learn something about the business when you're on the road, and you have to learn to live with people you don't necessarily like, you know, including your roommate some nights.
Right.